what I'm going to do with regards to the presentation is when I finish the presentation, I'm going to invite you to go over for the reception afterwards. They've prepared some kind of breakfast type thing. And anyone who would like to, I'll take a few minutes to answer questions if you have specific questions about this at the conclusion. Okay? So what we're going to talk about for these few days is spirituality. And when I was a youngster, I wanted to be a Franciscan when I was raised. And largely the reason I wanted to be a Franciscan was, I liked their habits. I was acquainted with Franciscan statuary in our parish. We had statues of St. Francis, St. Anthony, and Father Sarah. I was familiar with the history of the Franciscans in California. And they're a strong presence. Like if you tour California, you see a lot of the missions. You see a lot more of the Franciscans. And I think most of you know that every mission is named after a Franciscan saint. And so all these different things you would see as you go through the process. But it never occurred to me that there is a specific spirituality connected with being a Franciscan. And that spirituality is a set way of entering into holiness. And one of the things you begin to study is that there is a whole series of spiritualities. And if you might consider a spirituality, consider it like a stone. There are, there are diamonds, there's rubies, there's emeralds, sapphires. They're all different stones. And on each stone, there are different facets. So there are certain kinds of spiritualities, and we're going to cover them, that are connected with several of the traditions within the church, religious orders. Not all spiritualities are connected with a tradition. At the end, the last one I'm going to give you is a man who never founded a religious order, but his spirituality is becoming very powerful in the church today. Once you establish the spirituality is not exactly the same for every person who lives that. And I'll give you an example. There was an order established very early in the church on Mount Carmel, and that became the Carmelite order. And as it moved through history, probably close to 900 or 800 years after its founding, Teresa of Avila joined the order. And then later we would see Teresa of Lisieux join the order. And most recently, Teresa Benedicta, who's in our window back there, Edith Stein joined the order. All three of them are saints. And all three of them lived Carmelite spirituality, but all three of them lived it slightly in a different way. Okay? Spirituality is basically a way of living. And it's an effort to act, to think, to make choices based on our deepest ultimate values. Okay? One of the things you study in psychology, they call it ego and superego. Ego is the way we are, and superego is the way we like to think we are. And what spirituality tries to do is to take your superego and make it your ego, so that you gradually become the ideal. I remember a bumper sticker that's around Salinas. I'd love to buy one. But the bumper sticker says, "I hope one day to be the person my dog thinks I am." That's kind of what this is, that we want one day to become the person that we actually think we are. Okay? We want one day to become that person. With regards to religious people, this simultaneously seeks to be in contact with God, because God is the one who defines my ultimate value. Okay? So I want to be in contact with God and know what His ultimate value is for me. And again, I'd remind you that this is a Catholic church. It is very peculiar to individuals. You can study the lives of saints and find people who are so rich you cannot imagine it, and find people who lived with absolutely nothing. You can find people who spent their entire life in a hospital bed, and you can find people who were active like you cannot imagine. You find people who lived in unspeakable luxury, and people who were killed as martyrs. That spirituality has to do with something very peculiar for you. And so what you want to do is get in contact with God. When we talk about these different kinds of spiritualities in the church, we're talking about ways of getting in contact with God and how God really speaks to you. Okay? The very first one that developed in the church is called Arametical life. And the development of Arametical life began even at the beginnings of the church, before even the scriptures were composed. The beginning of the Arametical life. And Arametical, basically we would think of it as a hermit. The word Arametical comes from the word desert. And the reason is, in the early days, the bulk of these people went out to live in the desert. In fact, most of them went to Egypt. And we call them, in the Roman Catholic tradition, the Desert Fathers. But many traditions call them the Egyptian hermits. Okay? And that's because most of them went to the deserts in Egypt. Again, if you look at a map in the days of Jesus and see where cities and everything are, the largest bulk of desert you'll actually see is in Egypt. Today, when we think of Israel, we think of 4 or 5 big cities. There were 9 times as many cities in Israel in the days of Jesus as there are today. Probably villages, but they were all over the place. So they left the area. And they went into this particular life of the hermit. And one of the reasons they did that is that if you were to look at their world, you'd find that the world of idolatry created and supported violence and the misuse of money and sex. These things were supported largely by idolatry. Incidentally, in our tradition, it's supported by capitalism. But in their tradition, it was supported by idolatry. You'd find that in the idol worship, they had these terrible rites, sexual rites and this sort of thing. And you find that they were violent with regards to sacrifice, the way they dealt with people and animals and everything. It was just the violence and the sex were really tied to that world. And you could not escape it. And I just to give you one example that I'm sure you're all familiar with. I think it's a couple of years ago now. But, in our society, if you were to go to your TV and decide you're not going to watch anything, that would be offensive to you, and so you gather your family down to watch a football game. And then on the commercial, some woman rips a dress off. I mean, it is inescapable. Okay, it is not escapable. It doesn't matter how you decide to do it. You can be watching a Disney show. The commercial will do it then. Okay. If you watch pornography, it's probably advertised by Disney, so that you get it one place or the other. But the way these things are, it just permeates our society. And if you decide to escape it in our society, violence and sex are inescapable. Flat out, they're inescapable. So what would they try and do? They decided what they would do is escape society. And so they moved out largely into the deserts. Now, understand that this was supported a lot by the teachings of Jesus. You'll see Jesus say, I pray for those who follow me, but not for the world. In the world you'll have trouble. There is violence in the world. Jesus will say many, many things that will indicate there's something wrong with the world. And so that was enforced. It's also enforced if you were to study at this time in history. If you study Greek and Roman philosophers, you'd find out they say the same thing. Greek and Roman philosophers will say that if you want to, learn and understand and come to a knowledge, and this, you really need to get away from the world in which we are involved. Their main thing was not so much the violence. They were very concerned about the amount of sex going on. But the other thing is commerce, because commerce occupied people. So, however, the philosophers had a very different way of dealing with it. The philosophers normally did not escape by going into the desert. The philosophers were wealthy enough that they built themselves like little islands, and servants would deal with the world, and the philosopher would be sitting in his library or whatever, meditating and this sort of thing. And so the Greek and Roman philosophers presented the same thing. They're getting the message from the scriptures, and they're getting the message from the philosophers. So they would go off into this particular life as a way of really coming to know and understand themselves. people went to the desert to become hermits. And one of the things we study in the life of Jesus is that there are many times, the most intimate moments that we see with Jesus and his Father